Vancouver, Chicago, San Francisco, Philadelphia, San Diego, and more. These are some of the biggest cities in the US and Canada, and their transit agencies, often hailed as some of the biggest and most successful, are failing. They're simply running out of money, some as soon as this year, but most starting next year. And no, it's not corruption. Let's dive into why this is happening and what we can do to save transit in some of our greatest cities. You might have seen my video about Vancouver's TransLink and their financial troubles, but this is much bigger than one city. Countless mid-sized and large transit agencies are about to fall off what's called a fiscal cliff, and it's exactly as it sounds. They're running out of the money they need to maintain their existing transit services, otherwise called an operating deficit, and in this case, it's a big one. So, what causes a fiscal cliff, and why are they all happening at the same time? As it turns out, we're facing a bit of a perfect storm for transit agencies to run out of money, and there are several factors that have caused this to happen now. First, ridership is not back to pre-pandemic levels for most transit agencies. This is largely because travel patterns have changed so massively all over. Many people who once had 9-to-5 jobs can now work from home for some or all of the week, meaning they no longer rely on commuter-oriented transit services. If people who have these types of jobs, as well as people with jobs previously ignored by peak-only transit options who still want to use transit, it can't just run at peak hours. In the post-COVID era, transit needs to run all day, all week long, letting riders use it to get to work and school at any time, but also to restaurants, parks, grocery stores, and more. However, some transit agencies haven't adapted, still running many peak-only commuter services. Others can't afford to adapt. A transit agency might want to add more frequent midday, evening, and weekend service, but not have the money or drivers to do it. Speaking of drivers, a shortage of workers in transit systems has made it impossible for many of them to restore service to pre-pandemic levels, leaving them with no way to regain all of their ridership. Lower ridership leads to lower revenue, because most of these larger transit agencies rely on fares to generate revenue. This reduction in revenue means that agencies can't afford to offer as much service, which then leads to lower ridership because the service is less useful, which in turn leads to lower revenue, and so on. This death spiral is what will start to happen to our transit agencies very soon if we're not careful. The other main source of the funding shortfall is the end of COVID-19 relief funding. During the pandemic, transit agencies in the US and Canada were given federal funding to continue transit operations, ensuring they could still pay the bills and keep running buses and trains despite way lower ridership. Some state governments chipped in as well. This was great for transit agencies since it meant they had to worry less about their finances and could focus on the essential business of moving people from one place to another. However, most of this funding expires at the end of 2025 or in 2026. This is a significant portion of the revenue for many transit agencies that are still seeing ridership recovery, and means that they're about to see a major drop-off in income. This isn't very fair to the transit agencies, as they were basically given a deadline within which to recover to pre-pandemic ridership, despite changes in travel patterns, workforce struggles, inflation, and more holding them back. Put together, these factors create a perfect storm for losing money, and the cliffs are called cliffs for a reason. Without additional funding, we're about to see massive service cuts at some of the largest transit agencies in our countries. For example, TransLink in Vancouver, BC is looking at cuts that would eliminate transit service for over 500,000 people in the region, and Chicago is looking at cuts to 40% of its transit service. Massive numbers of people losing access to transit service in the biggest cities in our countries is something that we absolutely cannot afford to have in terms of the economy, the environment, and the social and physical well-being of our populations. With all of this chaos surrounding transit, there are many ideas on how to fix it, some of which will work and some of which won't. Let's start with the ones that won't work. First, we can't solve this by raising fares or increasing fare enforcement. While it's true that many of these transit agencies rely on fares for a significant portion of their income, it's important to understand the economics of transit fares, especially in terms of supply and demand. The majority of transit lines have more supply than demand, meaning the vehicles aren't running at 100% capacity. This is a good thing for passenger comfort, but it also means that we're capturing all the demand we can capture at our current service levels and with the current socio-economic conditions in our cities. If we were to raise fares, we would see a proportional decrease in ridership. This means that we likely wouldn't gain any new revenue by raising fares because we would have fewer riders paying that higher fare. This, of course, also leads to the obvious equity issues, as the people who would stop taking transit due to price are the poorest in our cities, and people we should focus on including the most in our transit systems. Speaking of fares, increasing fare enforcement won't solve the problem either. Again, the equity issue is obvious, as those who don't pay are likely to be those least able to pay for transit. However, the economics don't work out either. Fare enforcement is done through human officers patrolling transit vehicles, usually light rail and bus rapid transit vehicles that run on proof of payment systems, and handing out fines for passengers who don't have a valid fare. This is incredibly expensive, as we have to pay people to walk around our buses and trains all day. Even if fare enforcement was 100% effective at catching and fining every fare evader, which it isn't, it would be very difficult for it to pay for the cost of hiring the countless officers it takes to keep up a large-scale fare enforcement model. If we're going to be hiring more people to work for transit agencies, they should be driving and fixing buses and trains, not bothering riders and wasting agency time and money. Next, we can't solve this crisis by reducing executive pay. This one is simply a matter of scale. Budget deficits at these large transit agencies will be as high as $600 million per year, which is a ton of money. Reducing the salaries of agency CEOs and the like would save some money, but more to the tune of $1 million per year. I'm not against lower executive pay for transit or any industry, but we can't pretend that it's a silver bullet for our much larger funding issues. So, what can we do to fix this crisis? The answer is pretty simple. First, we need more money. Transit isn't a private business, nor should it be. It's an essential service provided to the public and should be paid for with public money, much like roads, utility lines, and schools. However, getting local support for transit funding can be difficult, which is why it's essential for state and provincial governments to step in and provide additional support for their transit agencies. This spreads out the burden of paying for these systems across larger areas, meaning that each person pays less for the system. And while additional funding from the federal government would be important, that doesn't look likely anytime soon, at least in the United States. Second, we need to make it easier for transit to do its job. Removing unnecessary restrictions and requirements on transit agencies will allow them to allocate resources as they see fit, providing more service where it's needed most. Let's look at a few examples of restrictions that we could lift from transit to make it more successful. First up are strict requirements for infrastructure funding. When King County Metro and the City of Seattle built the Rapid Ride G Line, they pledged to operate it every 6 minutes on weekdays and Saturdays. While 6-minute service on the line is great, it meant that King County Metro was forced to reduce service on surrounding bus routes, weakening the overall transit system. And while the G Line can be busy, it's never crowded enough to justify 6-minute headways on a regular basis. Running it less frequently, like every 8 or 10 minutes, would allow the agency to give service back to surrounding neighborhoods and have a stronger transit system overall. However, this isn't possible right now because of restrictions with transit funding involving federal infrastructure money. Another example of restrictions is electric bus requirements. This is especially relevant in states like California, where it's mandated that transit agencies switch to electric buses as soon as possible. While this is great in theory, electric buses cost several times more than conventional buses, and with tight budgets, this leads to reduced transit service. Agencies like MTS in San Diego are hoping to get these requirements waived or extended later into the future to allow them time to focus on their service levels instead. Another restriction we could reduce is laws regarding competition with transit agencies. Transit agencies aren't allowed to compete with private companies and school bus operators, making it difficult to run effective service at times, especially in lower density areas. Allowing transit agencies to run service when and where they see fit would be highly beneficial and could have the upside of reducing the driver shortage by combining school bus and transit workforces. The final way to get ourselves out of this transit crisis is to refocus our priorities. A lot of our transit agencies were stagnating before the pandemic and seeing declining ridership while their route networks stayed largely the same. The pandemic gave us the opportunity to take a look at transit from a new perspective. Work and travel patterns have shifted massively since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Reverse commuting outside of standard work hours, and hybrid work are more common than ever, and our transit systems need to be able to adapt. Instead of focusing on serving 9-to-5 office jobs, we should serve all types of trips, from anywhere to anywhere, which will promote greater regional mobility and allow people to use transit for everything in their lives. Allowing people to rely on transit for more types of trips will mean that we can count on higher ridership and therefore higher fare revenue overall. Additionally, commute-focused transit services tend to be less efficient. For example, a peak hours-only bus that runs express from a suburb to downtown typically runs out of service back to the suburb to make its next run. Having that bus run out of service isn't a great use of transit's limited resources, and putting that bus on a local route that runs all day and connects to a regional service means that we could get a lot more service for the money we're putting in. We should generally be redesigning our networks to be less focused on downtown, regardless of where we are. Transit isn't just for the 9-to-5 office worker, it's for the single mom taking her kids to elementary school. It's for the construction worker going to a job site. It's for the night shift worker getting to and from their job, and it's for everyone to access groceries, parks, and more. We're at an important turning point right now with transit. As service recovers from the pandemic, we're in a prime position to expand, allowing travel at all times of day for all types of trips and destinations. However, we have to fix our money problem. In conclusion, transit in large cities is a bit of a mess right now. Unfair restrictions and requirements combined with changing travel patterns mean that our transit systems are facing massive cliffs. And if we fall off, it'll take decades to get back on track. We need to act now and avoid the fall entirely. Transit is an essential service, and whether or not you use it, you almost certainly know or rely on someone who does. Let's not make transit riders' lives any harder, and instead give transit the funding it needs to continue to provide its efficient and essential services.